As you remember, in the previous video, we built the following config that describes our future form. And also, we created a group of interfaces in order to have better typings. In this video, we will try to build a basic form using the config from the previous video and render the form in the component view. So first, let's improve our typings and use a more explicit interface that describes a form config shape instead of using just an object type. Also, let's explicitly define the same response type for the get method of the HTTP client. Now, once we fetch the config, we can start to build our form because at this point we have all the necessary information for that. This operation I will do inside the RxJS tab operator that was designed exactly to perform side effects like this one. So here from the form config, I destructured the property controls and provided as an argument for the method called buildForm. This method I will create in a second. This operation will be executed each time the request to the server is performed and the new config is returned by this call. I hope it is clear for now. Now we have to implement the buildForm method that will initialize the form models according to the config that we will receive from the server. So somewhere here below the ng-only-init lifecycle hook, I'm going to create a private method which as an argument takes controls and their types we're going to fetch from the dynamic form config interface, just like that. The logic of this method will be quite simple. Firstly, it has to create a root form group instance, right? So let's create a dedicated class property somewhere right here above, and it is going to be an instance of the form group. And then in the buildForm method, we will be creating a new instance of form group and assign it to the form property. Great. However, the form group by itself is quite useless, so we have to create also corresponding form controls, right? Right, so let's do that. I will grab all the keys from the controls object like that, and by the control keys I mean those like display name, email, role, and so on. Those keys will be grouped into an array when we call the object keys method, so I can walk through this array using for each loop, getting the control key as an argument in the for each callback function. Then I do a super simple thing. I just add a new control to the existing form group using the add control method, where the control key is going to be a key from the config and the value is a new form control instance and its initial value is the one which comes from the JSON config. As easy as that. And in such a way, we just build a form model for the future form. We can even try to console log the value of this form model right after we build it, and we can have a look at it in the browser console. And if I try to load any of the forms, you can see in the console the corresponding fields. If I try to load another config, you can see that the form was rebuilt and other fields were printed out. Also, the next step is to render native form controls here instead of JSON config as we have right now. So let's get back to the VS Code and try to implement it. For that, I go to the component template and instead of rendering the JSON object, I will do the following thing. First, let's maybe render the form description to let the user know which form has been loaded exactly, right? So here we go. Then I want to walk through the controls and render form fields for each control. So I create a form field element that is simple div element and it also contains some label tag. And this is going to be a template for every form control. So let's generate this template for each control using the ng-for directive, and for that I will go through the control object that comes from the config. Currently, Angular compiler complains because the object isn't iterable, which makes sense, but I can split this object into key value pairs using a built-in Angular pipe called keyValue, which also makes the object iterable, and as you can see, the error in the template is gone. Since I applied this pipe, the control variable contains now two fields: the key, which holds the object key, and the value that contains the object, which corresponds to this key, right? And from this object here, I can read already the label property for this control. So basically the key of the control, those are exactly those keys, yeah, one of them. And the control value is the value that the object that corresponds to this key. I hope it's clear to you. And I can already do an intermediate check and make sure that proper labels have been rendered for the corresponding form config. Good. And now my goal is to render native control for every control from the config. And here things get a little bit tricky because different controls have different layouts. For that, we can build some switch case statement, which I'm going to attach to ng-container to not, introduce a new HTML tag. And the value for this switch case directive will be a value from the control type property. And here I do the following. I render the input element only if the value provided to ng-switch directive is equal to the string with the value input. So Angular just sees that, okay, it is defined as an input, so I will render the input layout. And for something else like select, I will render the layout that corresponds to this input type. So things like that, I hope it's pretty much clear. And here we can also adjust some attributes for the element like type, for instance, because it comes also from the config. The same thing I can do also for the control ID that should be equal to the key property, right? And input also can have a value. So let's do the same for this attribute as well. And if we check our application right now, you can see that at least input form elements have been properly rendered. And now let's get back to the code and do a simple thing, but for the select element. The template for select element cannot be expressed in one line, so I will create another wrapper using ng-container, and it will be rendered when the control type is a string with the value select. Also, here we have to create a native select control, right? And there the ID needs to be equal to the control key as well. And the value should be a value that comes from the form config. Then we have to render options, which we defined, if you remember, in the previous video, right here in the form config. And in order to render them, I will use again the ng4 directive, but this time I walk through the control options. And I'm going to provide the option value just like that. And also I render the label of this option, so user know what he or she selects. So here we go. The only thing maybe, let's rename this variable to option to be more explicit. Cool. And now let's move forward and let's check the application. So as you can see, there were also rendered not only inputs, but also select elements. The only remaining thing is that the template we rendered here knows nothing about the form model we built in the component class right here inside the build form method. And in the remaining couple of minutes, we will bind the model and template together. First, we have to import reactive forms module into our page component. So let's do that. Here we go. Then we have to bind this root form group with the form tag in the template, right? And if you remember, to achieve that, we have to use a dedicated directive that comes from reactive forms module, and this directive is called form group. And there we have to provide the form group as a value. And then to bind the form controls with corresponding models, we have to use another special directive called form control name. So for input and select, I attach that directive, and the value for this form group name directive should be a key we defined right here when we create the form model. And as you can see, it has to be a control key. So let's go and do the same in the template and provide the control key as a value for form control name directive. And that's it. We just bound the form model with the form template, which is cool. But before we go and do the final test, let's add a submit button to this form. So something like that. And then I also have to create a handler for the ng submit event right here. And then let's just go to the component class and create this handler. So somewhere here between those two methods, I will create it. So here we go. And here I'm just going to, console log the current form values. And after that, I will just reset the form values and the form control statuses. And already now we are ready to do the final test. So I can go and try to load different configs, and you can see that the fields, they were re-rendered accordingly. Then I try to type anything into some form control. You can see that the validation status has been picked up, which proves that the form model and form controls were successfully bound. And then I can fill out the rest of the fields like email, and then I can select the user role. And when I submit the form, you can see that the values were properly picked and synchronized, and the form itself was properly reset afterwards. And we are actually done for now. The only small detail that we could improve is to add some maybe a space between the form description and the form itself. But I think you can manage this task by yourself, or you can always go to the lesson commit and grab the code from there. But now let's move forward and see you in the next video.